Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Users, Groups, and Permissions in Core. My name is Eva Dace and I will be your host during today's webinar, which is being presented by Bethany Maddox. Bethany serves Vitex customers primarily at the support desk as the customer care specialist. Between support cases, she manages the overall vision of customer care at Vitex, developing instructional screencasts on various Core and Genesis topics and elements of software documentation. She has often served as host, writer, and technical manager of countless webinars throughout her tenure at Vitex. Now, before I let her take the stage, I need to review a few technical details. We're going to do questions a little differently today. Please send them in as soon as you think of them, as Bethany will pause halfway through a presentation to answer a few questions. We will also be holding a comprehensive Q&A session at the very end. As usual, please submit your questions using your webinar control panel. The webinar is being recorded today, so if you experience connection problems during the live presentation, a recording will be available within 24 hours of the live version in the webinar archive. So I'm going to chat out the link to the archive now in case you don't know where it is, and you should be able to see it in your chat window. So now I'm going to turn the mic over to Bethany. Welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for such a great introduction, Eva. Today we're going to dive deep on users and groups and permissions in Core. I've gone through all the documentation we have on the topic and talked to our QA team, all in an attempt to make this webinar the definitive guide on this topic. Here's a look at what we'll go over today. We'll start by clarifying a few terms that you're going to hear quite a bit. Then we'll set up users. We'll set up a group. We'll learn about setting permissions at different levels, and we'll wrap up the content with some notes on how importing is impacted by users, groups, and permissions. Then we'll open up the floor for questions. So let's start by clarifying a few terms. First, let's talk about users and groups. I use this phrase collectively to cover usernames that you use to log in, as well as groups to which users can be members. Users or groups can have permissions granted to them. Permissions are a set of rules that allow or restrict access to data. Today we're going to dive deep into the details of both users and groups and permissions. By the end of this webinar, you'll be armed with the key information you need to control access to your projects. So let's get started with users and groups. The first key thing you'll need to know here is about being a core system administrator. This is a special privilege granted to a user that allows the user to perform administrative tasks. Most of the tasks in the administration of user accounts and groups will require this privilege. Let's assume you just stood up your core installation and are beginning the preparation of user accounts. When you first install core, there is one user account, administrator. When you launch core, you'll see the login screen with administrator filled in for the user account, and we'll log in with this account. The password is admin. This master administrator account already has the core system administrator privilege. The first thing you'll want to do is to create a user account for whomever will be your primary core administrator. These administrative tasks are performed in administrative tools. You'll find a link directly to administrative tools from the welcome screen, or alternately, you can find it under the tools menu. From here, I can create a user account for myself. To do so, you just click the new user icon in the toolbar. Set the name and a password. Now that I've created an account for myself, I can make some adjustments to the account, including granting it core administrator privileges. To do this, you right-click on the account and select Properties. We've been talking about system administrative privileges, and this is where they are granted. Just add a check mark next to System Administrator. While we're here, let's break down the options in this dialog. Notice the Project Creation option. Enabling this will allow the user to create new projects. This option is enabled by default for all user accounts. We've found that in most cases, allowing project creation for everyone is desirable. Some of our customers prefer to restrict this privilege when working in a core server in order to prevent the server from getting cluttered with a lot of projects. This is entirely up to you. For what it's worth, Vitech's own core server is set up to allow our users to be able to create projects. However, we have the team understanding that we use our core server for collaborative projects only. Our personal projects we keep in a local repository. If you are logged into a core server and have a Core2Net installation, you'll see a third option here. If you don't have Core2Net, this option is suppressed. By default, new user accounts will have web access through Core2Net enabled. To disable it, just remove the check mark here. At the top of the dialog, you can fill in the full name of the user. Completing this will allow reports to use the name of the user instead of their username. Fill in the description as desired. I like to use this field to tag when an account is an administrator. This helps me have a quick view of who among my users have this privilege. Some teams use this field to display the user's role in the team. Use this field in any way that makes sense to you. Finally, add an email address. Core has the capability to run scheduled reports and email them to you, and this field is key in enabling that capability. There's a few more options. When you create a user account, it's typical to use the dummy password and then encourage the user to immediately change it. Setting the change password on next login option will force this password change. Maybe you have a formula for passwords or you don't want users to change it. You could do this by enabling the user cannot change password option. Finally, should you ever want to prevent this user from logging in, you can disable their account. We've put this option here because we don't recommend deleting user accounts when you have someone leave the team. Instead, we recommend simply disabling their login. This is important because all work done by this user is attributed to them in the history of the element. If you delete a user, then that work becomes attributed to, quote, unknown user. As you can see, creating user accounts is pretty easy. Just take a minute to set themselves up for your whole team. Even if you are working alone in a local repository, you should set them up for yourself. Core has a variety of change tracking options that attribute work to a username. By setting up a named user account, you'll ensure that your work is attributed to you. Should this work become shared in the future, all username references by the tracking mechanisms will have your name, not administrator. I mentioned previously that users can be made members of groups. These groups can be created to ease project administration. Once established, you can manage team changes by changing their group membership. When done in conjunction with setting up permissions to groups, this can greatly ease administration efforts as team membership changes. We recommend using groups even for small teams. This way, you set up the permissions once. You don't have to remember, document, or research who had what. When you need to change access for a team member, simply change their group membership. Let's take a quick look at setting up a group. Just click the new group icon in the toolbar. Give the group a name, then click OK. Now we can assign membership to the group. To do this, I'll right-click and select Properties. You can see here that groups are simple. Add a description, then add members to the group using the arrows below. Remember that the advantage to setting up groups is that you can assign permissions to a group. Then when your team membership changes, you can grant or revoke project permissions simply by editing membership in the group. This saves a great deal of time and effort in user account management. Now, before I hand this over to Eva for our first set of questions, let's review a few best practices. First, don't delete users. Disable their user account instead. Second, use groups to ease administration when staff changes. Third, have more than one core system administrator. This way, if somebody's gone or someone forgets their password, you have more than one person who can log in and help ease the administration tasks. And finally, give everyone a user account so that work can be attributed for that person even when you're working in a local repository. Okay, Eva, let's go ahead and pause and take a question or two.
All right, thanks, Bethany. Now, before we do take questions, I would like to introduce Donna Long. Donna is a systems engineer with over 20 years of practical experience in systems engineering and in using core. She is a member of Vitech's product management team, and she is the QA manager for core. So basically, nobody knows the product better. So welcome, Donna. Great to have you with us.
Great
so
to be
you
here,
are
Eva.
sitting in to help answer questions that require technical expertise, right?
Right.
Okay, wonderful. Great to have you with us. So let's move on to questions about the first half of the presentation. I encourage you all to join the discussion right now and submit your questions using your webinar Go control panel. So our first question is from Ingrid. If I never delete users, won't the system get a little cluttered?
Eva, this is Bethany. I'll go ahead and take this one. The answer is that we found not really. If you have a huge staff with constant change, is it possible? Yes. And there's a few ways that one can handle this. First of all, what we do is simply disable the user. We don't have enough turnover for it to become a clutter problem. But if you do, when you are upgrading from one version to the next, say 8 to 9, one of the things we recommend you doing is looking at all the projects you have in your repository and deciding which ones you need to keep in your server and only moving those other ones over. If you have projects that aren't active anymore, we recommend that you export them and archive them. Archive that XML file. So when you do that, you can include users and groups with that archive and then put that wherever your company has their archive mechanisms. We use SharePoint here, and we could just include that with it. And then I could, during the upgrade process, remove any extraneous users. Another option is to force them to the bottom of the list by editing the name. You could, if the username was B Maddox, and which it would be me, and I got hit by a truck, and Donna had to disable my account, then she could go in and say put a Z in front of my username, and then I drop alphabetically to the bottom of the list, and she knows everybody who got hit by a truck is a Z at the bottom of the list, and then she can kind of ignore those folks. And even though she edited my username a little bit, it's still going to maintain my history. And so those are two options. Like I said, we don't remove any at all. We still have some folks, and when we look in there, it's memory lane. But we've not run across that, but there's two choices if you do.
All right, thank you, Bethany. It looks like that's all the questions we have for now.
Okay, well, again, let's remind folks, if you have a question, send them to Eva as we go. No need to wait till the end. She'll get those queued up for me when we pause again at the end for questions. So let's dive back in and talk about permissions. Since you make decisions on permissions when you create a project, that seems like a really logical place to start. Let's take a look at the project creation options. Here you find 3 permission settings: course, medium, and fine. Course permissions are project level permissions. If you choose this, when you grant someone access to the project, they have access to the entire project. With the setting at medium, you add element level permissions. This means you can allow a user to see some elements, but not others. With the setting at fine, you add attribute level permissions. At this level, within elements, you can allow or deny access to certain attributes. So maybe you want somebody to have access to everything but the description field or a type field. You can lock just certain attributes out. Now, we did the first half of this webinar in PowerPoint, so I think it's about time that I get out of PowerPoint and get to my comfort zone and go hands-on with core. So let's make a quick switch here. All right, here we go. This is the project creation screen. So we're going to set up a project with fine level permissions. Now notice that medium is the default selection here, and it's the most commonly selected for the purpose of this presentation, and I'm going to use fine though. So let's get that set up. So notice I named that project 1. That's where we'll be starting. Now I'm going to go into administrative tools. Here's the second way to get to it. I showed a screenshot earlier of using the link from the welcome screen. It's also here under the tools menu. Now here we see administrative tools, and I have all of my projects shown. Now I'm going to right click on my project and select manage. And here there are 2 permissions related settings. Set project permissions and set initial element permissions. We're going to start with setting project permissions. This is the access control list where you can allow users or groups to access the project. On the left, you'll find a list of all users and groups that don't already have access. Notice that my user account is already in the pane on the right. The user who creates the project will automatically get access to the project and be set as a project administrator. Let's add another user. I'll add Donna by selecting her name and then clicking the right arrow. Notice when I added her that it preset some of the permissions down here in the bottom right. Let's break these down. I think read and write are pretty self-explanatory. Create element simply allows the users to create new elements. Folder will allow you to create new folders. And administrator will make you a project administrator. Project administrator permissions are required to perform a variety of tasks, including setting project permissions. Project administrator is also needed to import data, purge versions, baseline a project, and to write to the project registry. We recommend having more than one project administrator, so I'm going to add administrative privileges to Donna's account. Let's also add the My Team group, and I'm going to give them read, write, and create element permissions, but we'll take away folder here. And then click OK to commit your changes. Now let's go back, now that we've talked about setting the project level permission, and let's talk about initial element permissions. Again, this is right click, manage, and then we'll take set initial element permissions. Now these are exactly what they sound like. This tells Core what permissions to apply to an element when the element is created. Now this is only going to apply when we have a project that has medium or fine level permissions. If we chose coarse, again, it's all or nothing, so this wouldn't be applicable. Now this dialog is pretty similar to the project permissions. Read, write, and delete are all pretty straightforward. Element admin is needed to adjust element permissions after an element is created. So if we were working and Donna wanted to adjust permissions for the rest of my team later on, I have to make sure that she's set as an element admin. Well, I guess Donna's a bad example since she's a project admin. But let's say Eva was in my team, which she is, and she wanted to be able to adjust permissions. I've got to give her this in the initial initial element access control list. It's a big mouthful. Okay, so remember that this controls the permission setting when your element is created. So let's back out and take a look at how I change permissions once an element exists. So we're going to go back into the Project Explorer, and I set up a sample project that already has some data. So let's open that up. And bring it over. Here we go. Now we start by right-clicking on an element. So let's switch over to our requirement class, and we'll take a look at this one. And we're going to go to the Manage menu, and then Set Element Permissions. Now this access control list should be getting a little bit familiar, and this is where I make adjustments in the same manner using the arrows and then the check marks. So I can make any changes I want, maybe by adding Arthi, making her an admin. Now, what if I want to adjust adjust permissions on multiple elements? This is actually pretty simple. I can use a shift click or a control click method to multi-select the desired elements. So let's shift click here, take those, and then again, I just right-click, get Manage, Set Element Permissions, and here we see this access control list that is accessing the permissions on all of these elements. Now, this helps us get a sense of what permissions on an element already exist. I can see here all of these elements and who has what permissions. So what if I wanted to view the entire class? Let's do that. I'm just going to multi-select the entire class here. Now notice the permissions listed in the right side pane. These match the first letter of the permissions down at the bottom. Some are capital and some are lowercase, and this very small indicator is key. When the letter is capital, then this user or this group has the same permissions for all of the elements selected. So we can see administrator has read, write, and delete for all of the elements selected. When the letter is lowercase, then the user or group does not have the same permissions for all of the elements selected. So admin is not consistent for the administrator account in this case. So if you've edited element permissions along the way, this little trick is a handy way to determine if all of your elements have the same settings and then to later correct them. Now, let's take permissions a step further. Let's examine attribute permissions. By now, I think you're going to find me a little bit repetitive, but hang on with me. I'm going to right-click on an element and select Set Attribute Permissions. Now this familiar dialog has one notable difference. Notice the drop-down in the top right. I'll use this to select the desired attribute. Let's set the description. Notice that the list of users and groups populated on the left side, and there are not any users and groups on the right side right now. Attribute permissions are unique from other kinds of permissions in that they are inherited from the element permissions. To phrase that another way, whatever access I have to the element, I will also have to all attributes, at least at first. Now this holds true until you start editing attribute permissions. Now all other permissions levels work on the premise of allowing access. Attribute permissions work on the premise of denying access. Notice the deny options in the bottom right. This is primarily what I'll use in attribute permissions if I need to lock down access to any attributes. While we set permissions one attribute at a time, we can set them on groups of elements using the multi-select method we used for setting element permissions. There's one more special kind of attribute with its own permissions, and this would be parameters. And you're going to find these in the Parameters tab of an element. Now, I happen to know this element has a parameter set up. So there's the Parameters tab, and we've got an occupancy of currently 75 people. So to set the permissions here, we simply click the Permissions button. And you're going to get the access control list that's almost just like the one we saw for attributes, only this drop-down is going to be all of the parameters that are set for this element. Okay, so if I drop down, we'll see occupancy is there. And so I can set denials here the same way I would for any attribute, only this time we're setting them for parameters. Okay, so we're getting to the home stretch. Let's get back over to PowerPoint to wrap this up. Okay, as we wrap, I need to overview how permissions are related to the import and export of data. First, a key concept is that permissions are based on a unique ID. Each time you create a user account or a group, a unique ID is created. Then, when you grant permissions, those permissions are associated with the unique ID, not the username. This is key for teams that use data in both a core server and a local repository. If I were to create an account for myself in my core server, then create another account for myself in my local repository, each would have different unique IDs. If you work in a core server, we recommend exporting users and groups from the server, then importing them into your local repository. This will ensure that when you log in, you're always getting the same permission set. Now, when you log into a core server, you'll see an option that says Synchronize Remote Accounts. And I apologize, I don't have a screenshot for you, but it's a check mark just below the repository field. And if you select that, that will automatically cause this synchronization to happen for you, and you don't have to perform an export import. So we've built that in. Most of the time when you log into a core server, you want to turn that off because you want to get in quick. But periodically turn that on, get your update, and your users and groups will always be synchronized. Okay, now when you export data, permissions are always included, always. Even if you don't include users and groups information with the export. Remember that users and groups is just the list of login names, the list of groups, and the IDs, the unique IDs that are associated with them. So I can export data without that, but permissions always are with my data. Therefore, if the permissions always export, they also always import. And this is going to happen at the end of the import. I've seen cases where the customer told me they imported a project, and then it seemed to disappear. At the end of the import, they couldn't see it. Now, this will happen if a user doesn't have read permissions on a project, because we get through all the data, it brings in the permissions, and disappears. So you can import it, but then you won't be able to see it. Well, Eva, that wraps up all the content I have prepared for today. So I'm sure you have some questions for me.
I sure do, Bea. I have a question here from Clausian, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name. He is asking, is there any plans to set permissions per folder and or class, such as requirements, use cases, and so on?
That's a really good suggestion, and we have implemented that in our next generation software, Genesis. It's not something that we're planning to do in core at this time.
All right, thank you, Donna. And if Clausian was interested in getting more information about Genesis, who should he contact?
Klaus should contact his account executive, and I think he's out west, so that's probably going to be Warren Smith.
All right, great. Our next question here is from John. He is wanting to know how to change project permission level setting after the project was created.
Okay, Eva, just to clarify the question, so I've created a project and I have set the permissions at medium, and I realize I really needed fine. What do I do? Donna's going to take this one.
Thanks for the clarification. If you need to change the level of permissions on a project, you will have to export your data, create a new project with the permissions you want, the permission level you want, and import that data. If you're moving to a finer selection, say you're moving from medium to fine, then it will import without any errors. If you're moving from medium to coarse, you will get an error that says there's a permission level mismatch, but all of the permissions will be taken away for the elements.
Okay, any more questions, Eva?
Thanks very much, Donna. Actually, it looks like that is it. So if anyone has any other questions or comments that they didn't get a chance to send in today, don't hesitate to shoot Bethany an email. Let me chat that out using the chat feature and GoToWebinar. And you can also post your questions in the forum on our community site at community.vitechcorp.com. So that just about wraps up today's presentation. Thank you all for joining us. And be on the lookout for the next webinar of the season. We should be adding it to the calendar in the next few days. And in case you don't know where that is, let me chat out the link to the calendar now. There you have it. At the conclusion of this webinar, a survey will open on your screen. Please take a moment to give us feedback on today's presentation or any topics you'd like to see covered in future webinars. So that is all for today. Once again, thank you for joining us and have a wonderful day.